So at the start of chapter 6, I mentioned that we would study bones as tissues and as organs. So let's begin by taking a more in-depth look at bony tissues. So recall that we had started this discussion of bony tissues way back in chapter 4, but we'll expand upon it here. So bone, of course, is a connective tissue as it contains extracellular matrix in addition to cells. So let's start by looking at the extracellular matrix of bone, and then we'll continue on with looking at the cells of bone tissue. So there are two types of bone tissue. There is spongy bone and compact bone. Now, bones are not solid structures, so that is, their interior is usually filled with this honeycomb type of bone that is called spongy bone. And spongy bone is lightweight and supportive. Now, spongy bone is made of these small needle-like pieces that are called trabeculae, and typically in living bone tissue, so this is a bone that has been dried out and cut open so that we can see its internal structure, but typically in living bone tissue, there would be red bone marrow or even some yellow bone marrow occupying the spaces that you see between these trabeculae of spongy bone here. And the outer surface of bone is solid and smooth thanks to a type of bone that's called compact bone. Now, compact bone is what we saw in chapter 4, and so recall that from chapter 4 that compact bone is arranged into these ring-like structures that we called osteons. And osteons contain these ring-like pillars of bone that are nested within one another, and those ring-like pillars are called lamella. We also see in the center of the osteon, we have a central canal which contains blood vessels and nerve fibers. And these blood vessels nourish the cells of the bony tissue. That is, they nourish the living portion of the bone tissue in living bone tissue. Of course, when we look at it under the microscope, it's been preserved and dried out, so we don't see those living elements anymore. But in living bone tissue, these blood vessels are providing nourishment to the living cells that are helping to maintain the bone structure itself. We also saw in the osteon here, we saw these little pit-like structures called lacuna, and the lacuna in living bone tissue is where you'll find bone cells that are called osteocytes. Now, this is one type of cell that functions in maintaining the extracellular matrix of the bone tissue. And so in those little pit-like structures called lacuna, we see that there are osteocytes. Now, the central canals, kind of looking at them from the microscopic view we had previously, it kind of looks like they're all independent or separate of one another. And it turns out that that's not the case. It turns out that although the central canals tend to run vertically in bone tissue, there are horizontally oriented canals called perforating canals that help to connect adjacent central canals in adjacent osteons here. And so that allows a passageway, kind of a continuous passageway for blood vessels and nerve fibers to make their way through the entire bone tissue itself, or the entire bone structure, I should say, itself. This image here also gives us a much better view of the pillar-like structures that are the lamella. So I've described before lamella as pillar-like rings of bone, and that are kind of nested within one another, kind of like a telescope, essentially. Except in living bone tissue, of course, this does not expand out in any way. In this diagram, they've simply pulled out this osteon here so that you can see that these lamella are actually essentially tubes of bone tissue nested within one another. So, but normally they would all be adjacent to one another. Just in this view, we're looking at it in a slightly different way there. So the reason that lamella are oriented in the way that they are, they tend to be oriented vertically because they are oriented parallel with the force of body weight. So that way they can act as weight-bearing columns or pillars, similar to the weight-bearing pillars or columns that we've seen in some architecture to help support buildings. And so that means that the force of body weight is being supported by the entire length of the lamella there. So minerals are not the only material, that is, bony minerals are not the only material that make up the lamella. They also have collagen fibers essentially woven through them. And a really interesting thing I think about the collagen fibers in the lamella is that the fibers run in different directions, or the fibers are kind of aligned in different directions in adjacent lamella. So in one lamella, they maybe have kind of a clockwise, or I should say, in this example, I think it would be a counterclockwise twist. In this one, they're kind of wrapped in sort of a clockwise twisting fashion. In the next one here, it's changed direction again, and now it's kind of a counterclockwise twist here. And so what we see is that the collagen fibers alternate directions, and this alternating of directions of these collagen fibers help make these lamella resistant to twisting in any direction. So that is, these lamella can be twisted in a clockwise direction or a counterclockwise direction, and that helps the entire osteon be resistant to a twisting motion in any direction that it happens to be twisted. So I think that's kind of cool right there. What we also see in compact bone is that next to the lacuna, or adjacent to the lacuna, are what look like little fibers kind of extending from them. And these small fiber-like structures that you are seeing here that are extending out from the lacuna are not really fibers at all. It turns out that they are actually small channels or tunnels that connect adjacent lacuna. And so these are channels that are called canaliculi, or if you want to think of them as canals, right? They're referred to as canaliculi. And it turns out that the reason they have this structure is that the osteocytes that reside in those lacuna have these small little like bristle-like extensions. And these small little extensions help connect this osteocyte to adjacent osteocytes. And so really what the canaliculi are small channels that house these cellular extensions off of our osteocytes. And these extensions allow these osteocytes to act like a little network within this osteon here. And that means that these osteocytes can share nutrients that are provided from this central canal here. And all of these osteocytes can also remove wastes and deliver them to the blood so they can be removed from the body. And so in this way, the osteocytes can behave as a small network so that they can share nutrients and remove wastes. We see that the cellular extensions that connect adjacent osteocytes are actually joined together by, or adjacent osteocytes are actually connected by gap junctions through those little cellular extensions. And remember that gap junctions are small tunnel-like passageways that connect the interior of one cell to the interior of another cell. So basically what that means is that materials are able to pass pretty easily from one osteocyte to another. And so this is really what helps to facilitate the exchange of nutrients and wastes between the osteocytes in one osteon there. So let's really briefly look at the chemical composition of bone tissue. So here we're looking more at the extracellular matrix. In a minute here, we'll turn our attention to the cells of bone tissue. So as far as chemical composition is concerned, we have two main categories of chemical elements within bone tissue. We have the inorganic components and the organic components. Now, the inorganic components make up kind of the majority by mass, so almost 2/3 of the mass of our bones are these inorganic components. And when we say inorganic, we mean non-cellular and non-protein substances here. In this case, because it's bone tissue, the primary inorganic component are calcium phosphate minerals. And these calcium phosphate minerals are beneficial to bone tissue because they help bone tissue resist compression. And so these are this is a really good material for resisting those weight-bearing compressive forces that are trying to crush bones, but calcium phosphate minerals actually resist those crushing or those compression forces because of this. But notice that calcium phosphate minerals don't make up all of the bony tissue. So the remaining roughly 1/3 or about 35% of the mass of bone tissue are the organic components. And so these are the cells and the protein fibers. The primary substance that contains the protein fibers is a material called osteoid. It's really, the bulk of it's kind of made of collagen fibers. And collagen fibers, of course, if you recall from chapter 4, their function was to be a biological rope. And so in that regard, they act in resisting tension or pulling forces. So we've got the compression resistance of the calcium phosphate together with the tension resisting element that is delivered by these collagen fibers. And so bone can resist both compression and tension. Bone tends to be a lot better in compression than it is in tension, but the collagen fibers in bones do help the bones to resist tension and be flexible somewhat. So the remaining organic components are going to be the cells, which we'll look at in the last part of this in this lecture module here. So let's take a look at types of bone cells. We see 5 types of bone cells, and we'll look briefly at all of their functions and what they do. So first we have these osteoprogenitor cells. Osteoprogenitor cells will give rise to osteoblasts, and these osteoblasts will give rise to osteocytes, and kind of similar to osteocytes in terms of their function are these bone lining cells. And then last but not least here we have osteoclasts, which come from a different cell lineage, so that all of these here that you see, osteoblasts, cytes, and bone lining cells are all derived from osteoprogenitor cells. Osteoclasts have a different function, and they actually come from the same cellular lineage, if you will. So let's take a look at all 5 of these cell types and what they do. So let's start with those osteoprogenitor cells. So osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells, which means a stem cell is a relatively unspecialized type of cell. That is, it has not really been given a specific function within the body yet. The term that biologists tend to use for unspecialized cells are undifferentiated cells. So we would say that stem cells are relatively undifferentiated. That is, they haven't received a specific role in the body. Their role instead is to undergo mitosis. So essentially their job is to proliferate, make more of themselves. Because when some of these osteoprogenitor cells are stimulated, they will become more specialized in their function. That is, they will differentiate and become a different cell type so that they can perform a different function. So if we stimulate some of these, if the body stimulates some of these osteoprogenitor cells to differentiate, some of those will become osteoblasts. And so osteoblasts are bone-forming or bone-building cells. So I like to think of the B as in blast as in building, right? So these are bone-building cells. And the way that they build bone is that they secrete the collagen protein fibers as part of the organic components, and they also secrete a number of proteins that bind calcium minerals to them. So notice that they do not secrete calcium minerals into the bone matrix. Rather, what they're doing is that the calcium binding proteins that they're secreting help to stimulate calcium minerals, help stimulate calcium minerals crystallizing on those calcium binding proteins. So really the calcium binding proteins are providing the stimulus for calcium minerals from the blood to come and crystallize on them and form those calcium minerals that we see within the bones. So the osteoblasts are not actively secreting calcium. Instead, they're producing proteins that are stimulating the mineralization or the crystallization of calcium on them. So eventually these osteoblasts laying down these protein fibers and calcium binding proteins will eventually become surrounded and trapped in the matrix that they secrete. And when that happens, the osteoblasts will differentiate or change again into a cell type called the osteocyte. Now, osteocytes are mature bone cells that occupy the lacuna that we see in the bone tissue. And their main functions are to monitor and maintain the bony matrix, so they maintain those organic components that we see within the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. They also act as sensors of mechanical stresses, so pulling and pushing force, or pulling and compressive forces, I guess I should say, on bony tissue is what they will monitor. And then they will communicate those mechanical stresses to the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, because these are the cells. Osteoblasts, as we saw, are bone-forming cells, and osteoclasts, which we have not seen yet, are cells that break down bony tissue. And so in that way, osteocytes are communicating to the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts as to where new bone should be built or where old bone should be broken down. So we see that they're kind of playing a communication role as well within the skeleton. We also have bone lining cells, which are a flat, almost kind of squamous type cell that tend to be found on the superficial surfaces of bones where no remodeling, that is, no breakdown or building is currently happening. And we see that bone lining cells tend to function very similar to the osteocytes that we had just discussed, in that bone lining cells help to maintain the bone matrix. So that is, they're kind of monitoring and maintaining the organic component of the bone matrix there. So last but not least, we have osteoclasts, right? And osteoclasts are very large cells. That is, these are giant cells that contain many nuclei and lots of Golgi apparatus associated with those nuclei. Now remember that Golgi apparatus are helpful, or apparati are helpful, in that they are packaging proteins for export from the cell. And what osteoclasts end up doing is they make a number of enzymes that are capable of breaking down the bone tissue. And so we say that they function in bone resorbing. So really what we mean when we talk about bone resorbing is we mean bone breakdown here. So they make a number of enzymes that are manufactured within the cell, packaged for export from the cell by the abundant Golgi apparatus that they have. And those enzymes are released by exocytosis into the space outside of the cell, where they will then where those enzymes will then work to break down the bone matrix that is there. This border here that has these kind of rough edges to it is called the ruffled border, and this ruffled border sits against the bone tissue that they're resorbing, or breaking down. So this ruffled border gives the site of bone breakdown a lot more surface area. So the reason why we have this ruffled border is to increase the surface area against which the bone is being broken down. So unlike the other bone cells we've seen, these cells are not derived from the osteoprogenitor cells. Instead, osteoclasts come from the same line of cells that create macrophage white blood cells. And remember that macrophages are the cells that are involved in engulfing and destroying microorganisms and cellular debris. And so osteoclasts come from that same lineage, because they're performing a pretty similar function within the bones, in that they're looking to break down that bony tissue so that new bony tissue can be laid down either there or somewhere else within the skeleton.